Welcome. How are you all? No, right. I compare all my audiences to Sweden. Because in Sweden, when you ask, or how are you, there's just a silence. Nothing. And they all look gloomy, and they all look like they're falling asleep, and they all look miserable, and they all look like angry at you. And then you come out and they're like, great talk. I'm like, okay, good. So, but Polish, I love Poland. It's my third time here, and it's an amazing country. This time I actually got to go outside as well. And similar to what John was saying, I suck at tourism. But anyway, so my talk today is about moving the web to the client, which basically is a talk about some client-side frameworks combined with some back-end stuff and how you can kind of do better or productive or more efficient web development these days. But before I get into that, how many of you here are .NET developers? Okay. It's like, how many of you are Java developers? Okay, so we got a, no, we don't got a good mix. No, we got a bad mix. Okay, well, I'll just pretend in my head that there's a good mix. Right, good. So it's about half-half, right? Okay, great. How many of you are web developers? Right. How many of you have ever done anything with web frameworks such as AngularJS or Ember or stuff like that? Okay, quite a good portion of you. Great. Cool. So this is not a session about deep AngularJS, and it's not a session about the deep server side. It's a little bit just trying to show how I'm doing web development nowadays and finding it enjoyable, and see if you find it enjoyable too. And if in a year it's not enjoyable, doesn't matter. Just forget you saw this session. It's not going to be recorded or anything. Oh, it is? You know, you could give me heads up on these things a little bit. Right, forget what I just said. Anyway, let's take a quick look of history of web development, because I don't have a lot of time to talk. If you look at the typical web application, there's always been a browser with the HTTP server, and then you've had a CGI in the middle that is often known as the Common Gateway Interface, well, always known as a Common Gateway Interface, talking to a database. How many of you are old enough as me that have done CGI? Right, more or less. If you were like a year older, then you had probably done ISAPI, which was because in the old days the problem with CGIs was that it was an executable, so you would basically load an executable, and every request loaded a new executable, and then Microsoft said, okay, well, let's do ISAPI, which was basically a DLL that was one DLL per the whole application, and then there was NSAPI, which I think at some point died out from Netscape, or Netscape died as well. But if you look at CGI, you look at JSP, look at web form. How many web form developers here? Don't be shy. Go on, put up your hands. Like it's that part of my life that I want to forget and move on from. Right? I asked this last week in a Java conference, and I was like, "What the hell is web forms?" I'm like, sorry. Anyway. Web forms, it's this thing that Microsoft should never have invented, because they thought that it was a good idea to take all the Visual Basic developers to the web, forgetting that, you know, before we used to have one machine per developer, per application, per consumer, and then we just thought that one server could handle the load. But they solved that problem, right? They introduced this thing called view state, which they appropriately said never use. Rails, how many of you have done Rails? That's Ruby. That's for the hipsters. I guess not a lot of hipsters here. Spring, how many have done Spring? 3 Java guys. Okay. ASP.NET MVC. Now, everyone's doing ASP.NET MVC nowadays, right? Because that's the cool thing. Because web form sucks, ASP.NET MVC is good. Oh, no, that was yesterday. It was good. Today, it's Web API, right? Yeah. Remember, there's a distinction between Web API and ASP.NET MVC. What is it? It's called marketing. That's the distinction. They didn't know where to stick Web API, so they said that there's a difference. But if you look at all of these technologies, it's fundamentally the same thing, right? There's a browser, there's this thing called HTTP in the middle, and there's a server. So in these years, how much progress have we had with the protocol HTTP? Yeah, exactly. What about with the server side? Well, we've had quite a lot of progress, right? We've had all of these different frameworks that have been popping up and making things so much easier to develop applications with, you know, the beauty of things like building abstractions across the web, you know, things like drag and drop technology, which was fantastic, and I'm being really sarcastic here. And they made our life a miserable hell. And we also thought it was a good idea to abstract HTML. Brilliant. Who came up with that idea? It wasn't such a good idea, was it? But what we've also done, unfortunately, is abstract HTTP. Throughout this time, we've just kind of forgotten that this thing called HTTP exists, and we've started to treat this thing as a transport protocol as opposed to an application protocol. Just yesterday, someone sends me an email. They're like, oh, listen, I got a question. We're building a RESTful service, and I need to, there's a debate going on whether we should, when there's an error, should we send back a 200 OK and then a text message of what the error is? I'm like, do you know there's more than 200 status code? Well, yeah, there's 500 as well. Yeah. Yes, send back 500. But seriously, if you look at HTTP, it's been undervalued, really. We've just used it as a transport protocol as opposed to what it really is, which is an application protocol. And it's got these things called headers, and it's got these things called statuses, and it's got these things called status codes, and a whole bunch of things that haven't been utilized. Now, fortunately, with this focus on RESTful systems, people are starting to take HTTP a little bit more serious. I mean, it only constitutes the backbone of everything that we do nowadays, right? What about progress with the browser? Well, we've come a long way. How many of you have ever used this? Right. I feel really old right now. Yeah, well, you're always my condolence there. It's like, you know, consolation, sorry. I carried the inner around as consolation. There is, but we've had advances in JavaScript, right? And we've had advances in HTML. I mean, we've had advances even in CSS to allow something like Angry Birds in the browser. How many of you have played that in the browser? Right? But still, we kind of are reluctant to embracing these things. And we're still trying to find the easiest way to do web applications and abstractions, etc. So why is there this resistance? I mean, nowadays, there's a lot of frameworks. There's Knockout, there's Ember, there's AngularJS, there's Backbone. But there's still, I find, a little bit of resistance in using these things. First of all, there's the fear of spaghetti code, right? Yep. Like I said, JavaScript should be like taxes. Yes? Keep them to a minimum, and when you do it clean. Because no, who loves JavaScript here? I mean, let's be honest. Who truly, absolutely loves it? Right. Who puts up with it? Who hates it? Oh, yeah. You're just so cruel to JavaScript. There's this tendency of, you know, if we use a lot of JavaScript in our code, then we're going to create spaghetti code, which is absolutely and utterly true, right? Now, things helped, and not everybody knows JavaScript. Everybody knows jQuery, and jQuery came, and everybody said, I love JavaScript. No, you love jQuery. And we started to create these things in jQuery, and we created these fabulous pages, but we still created a lot of garbage code, right? So now, instead of having a lot of JavaScript crap, we have a lot of jQuery crap. And it's because of the powerfulness of the language, the ability to allow you to do different things and not restrict you, that gives you advantages, but it also gives you disadvantages because it provides you with no guidelines. It provides you with no kind of like safety net, so to speak. So there is some of that truth. Then there's the aspect of I don't use frameworks, I only use libraries, right? Because frameworks restrict me, and I won't ever use any client-side framework because I'm against the concept of frameworks, and yet on the server side I am speaking to you using Web API or MVC, which are conveniently not a framework, right? So that's just, you know, there is a amount of truth to this that yes, if you follow a framework, you have to follow the guidelines. But hey, there's a trade-off in everything. And if there is a framework that's extensible enough that allows you to do what you want to do, there is no objection to using it. So there shouldn't be this dogmatic approach of I will never use a framework. And Angular, fortunately for me, I think is one of those that allows this extensibility. There's the learning curve, right? There's the argument about not using these things of the learning curve. It takes me a long time to learn something, which is true, right? But here's the thing that you might not know. If you learn something like AngularJS and use it in a project, as soon as that project finishes, you're not going to forget everything you knew, right? You're still going to keep that knowledge. And if you don't use AngularJS, or if you don't use another framework, you're going to have to write the code yourself. And writing the code yourself is going to end up into what? Can anybody tell me? Another framework, right? Because at some point you're going to say, I'm not going to repeat this over and over again. I'll just reuse. But then that reusability comes, oh, well, I should adapt it here and do that and use some convention here and do that. And you end up with a framework anyway. But you have to learn like you learn everything else. It's suddenly like when it comes to languages, we're fine learning new languages. When it comes to frameworks, like, no, it's got a learning curve. I'm not going to learn it. So it's rubbish, summing up. There are benefits, though. It improves the user experience. It drastically cuts down the amount of code that you write. Yes, it does. It really does. And as I said, you learn it once, and it will survive for quite a while. But one of the things that I've found as a benefit is that it forces me to think about the backend as simply an API. And whether you want to do everything with client-side frameworks or no, I think this is an important concept. I go back to the field that you guys know, which is .NET development. If you know, back in the old days, we used to have this thing called ASP.NET MVC. And it had a model view and a controller, right? And then it was providing you with a view, and then you could return data in the view, etc. And then Microsoft decided to come up with this other thing called Web API. And their guidelines and their documentation on the website was saying, when you're creating an application, use ASP.NET MVC for the user interface and use Web API for the API, right? Now that is absolute and utter nonsense, because there is no real distinction. And you will see, and they're going now down the route of joining the two things. There is no distinction. If you look at your view, the user interface, as just another consumer of your API, it's the same thing. Right? In fact, when we're talking about RESTful constraints and REST resources, HTML is nothing but another representation of a resource. You can have it in JSON, you can have it in CVS, you can have it in XML, and you can have it in HTML. And when you're doing this kind of web application development and you use ASP.NET MVC, you tend to say, okay, well, I'm just going to focus this on returning web pages, returning web pages, returning web pages. And then the time comes for you to return JSON, and you're like, oh, how do I do this? Well, I'll just add a web API controller, and I'll separate that out, that logic. But then now you start to have to maintain two code bases. When you start to move some of these things to the client side using client-side frameworks, your backend simply just becomes what? A system for you to emit data and push data to. And then that endpoint then talks to your business logic, your domain, or what have you, that does the processing. But now you look at your backend as simply an API for you to get data and push data to. That's all it becomes. And that is what this is kind of about. It can nowadays become that. And you can combine front-end client-side frameworks to provide a very rich user experience and keep the backend to simply processing and data storage. So, as I said, there is no difference between a web application and an API. In my world, or as I like to view it, it's the same thing. It's your web application is your API. I love saying things that then appear on slides. Okay, so which framework? Now, there are tons of frameworks out there. I'm not going to knock anyone in particular, but there is Knockout, there's Ember, there's Angular, there's Durandal, there's Breeze. There's a whole bunch of different frameworks. Some of them do something, some of them don't do some things. I have tried a couple, and I'm not going to name the ones that I have tried and I disliked, but I'll just tell you that I really liked AngularJS. And I liked AngularJS for several reasons. One of them is that it allows me to, it clearly guides me in a way of where I should put my things. right? Which I find convenient, because when you have a series of guidelines, it's very easy to know where each thing goes, and the next person that comes along knows where each thing goes, and you kind of help promote the code, keep your code clean. Secondly, it's extensible. And it's extensible in a way that it actually adds meaning to my language, to my web application. It adds a lot of semantics, which we're going to see. Okay, so I'm going to show you AngularJS, and I'll show you some of the things that I've fallen in love with in AngularJS, and then I'm going to talk about some stuff on the back end of how you can consume data using AngularJS and something else that I've been working on. Okay, so what is AngularJS? It's absolutely everything you can think of, right? It's like the kitchen sink. Everything is thrown in there. It's contrary to some of the other frameworks, like, for example, Knockout, which is mostly about model MVVM framework, which is about data binding. Angular has a whole bunch of things, including a separation of concerns, which is one of the most important things, that it allows you to easily separate out your code. It provides you with out-of-the-box dependency injection, data binding, routing, templates, and the whole list of things that you see up there. But some of the design decisions that they've made actually makes it very clean and simple to work with. In essence, if you want to think about it, you have the concept of a view, the controller, and the model in AngularJS. So that concept exists, whether you want to call it model view controller or model view model, I don't care. It's the flavor of the month acronym, but the concept of the three separation of these different parts exists. And we're going to dive in now, and I'm going to show you some of the things that you can do with AngularJS, and then combine that with some things in the back end. Any questions? No? Okay, let's move on. No, seriously, you can ask questions. Yes?
So what you said about the application being just the API, does that mean that you don't actually do the initial rendering of HTML within Web API or ASP.MVC, but only on client and grabbing the data?
So the question is, if the backend is only the API, do I render the initial thing with the cert backend? So if you're using something like AngularJS or front-end web framework, basically most of the work is done on the client side, right? And you can just emit a static HTML page effectively, and you can have your web application do that. So Web API can do that, ASP.NET MVC can do that, or you can have the server you're hosting it on do that. So you can have that emitted by IIS or whatever you want. Okay. Right, so this is AngularJS. No, it's not. This is an HTML page, which is AngularJS. Right. Come on, people, wake up. I said wake up, don't be condescending. Right, I'm going to debug this in the browser, which means it'll launch in the browser. Right, so here I have my little application. Can you all see this? And I kind of write Hadi and blah, blah, blah. You see that as I write, it actually updates that on the page, right? And that is simply done very easily by just, it's really hard to work at a very low resolution here, so bear with me. So basically what I have here is just a static normal HTML page, which I've added a little thing at the top here called ng-app. Right? And ng-app is what indicates that this is an actual AngularJS application. And that ng-app is a directive, which is in this case being used as an attribute, and I'll tell you a little bit more about directives later on. But basically this is saying, it's telling AngularJS to kick in. Okay? And down here I have the one AngularJS file, which is angular.min.js. Now they've actually, in the new version, they've separated this out into several files. So if you're not using some parts of AngularJS, you don't need to include them. But the minimum that you require is angular.min.js. And what I'm doing here is I'm just saying, hello, name, your email is, and I'm using these double curly braces. And these double curly braces are placeholders for the model that AngularJS is binding to. So here I have a typical input text, nothing specific, but now I have an AngularJS specific attribute, which is ng-model. So now this is creating a binding for name, and I can use this binding over here. Okay, it's that simple. If I remove this attribute over here, guess what's going to happen? It's not going to work. So I don't get any of the binding and I don't get any of these replaced. As soon as I replace it, then it will work. Okay? So, was that easy? Yes. No, don't clap now. Don't. I'll tell you when to clap. So, what else do I have here? There's there's a whole bunch of directives. I mean, I'm not going to go through all of the directives. I just want to show you a little bit about how it works. But there's another directive that lets you initialize something. And in this case, what I'm doing, I'm initializing an object, person, by just using JSON. So JavaScript object notation. So here's name, Joe, email, Joe at email. And then here I have the person, and I'm just referencing that person. And obviously, this one should also work. If we browse, you can see that I have Joe person and the email. Okay, very easily just get JavaScript. Now that JSON object is coming right now from inside the web page. Obviously, that's of absolutely no value other than me doing a demo. Normally, you would get that from the back end. But very easily, you can get that data and then bind to it. And of course, you can iterate through data. So for example, here I have a UI. Instead of initializing a single object, I'm initializing an array. And then I'm iterating through it how there's another directive which is called ng-repeat, which is going to iterate through an array of elements. So let's run this one, and you can see that I have a list of names there. Okay, so very simple. Now, how many of you have been doing things like this using JavaScript, plain old JavaScript? Using jQuery. Is it hard to do this in jQuery? No. Who said no? Okay, so it's not hard to do in jQuery because AngularJS actually uses a light version of jQuery under the covers, right? But is this easier to understand than jQuery? Yes, because this is not removing the semantics from the page. Or better said, it's not really adding semantics yet. However, it is not polluting with a lot of things that don't mean anything with what you want to do. So you're not seeing the how, you're seeing the what, so to speak. Does that come out well? Yes, you agree with that? Even if you don't, I'm going to continue. Okay, so now, that's just the view. So what we have, I spoke about this being a model view controller. So we actually have a controllers. Now, here what I'm doing is I'm saying that I have this view, and this view has a div in it, and the div has an associated controller. So already Angular allows you to basically have a controller associated with a page, which basically you could just take one big div and put everything in there. You can have multiple controllers in the same page, in the same HTML page. There is no guidance there in telling you how you should do it, right? But when we talk about model view controller, think of this now as being the view, not the whole page, but basically what that controller is encapsulating, what that controller is referencing. And now let's take a look at this home controller. So you can see here that apart from the AngularJS file, I've now included a controller.js file, right? And if I navigate to this guy, you can see that I'm defining a controller. How do I define a controller in AngularJS? So when you create an AngularJS application, remember that we had the ng-app back in the first demo. If we go back to the page here, you can see that I've added a string to that. Here I've called it controller app. And that refers to the application that Angular is called, right? So every Angular application has a name. In this case, it's called controller app. How do you define that application? You define it using angular.module, give it a name. Here you pass in a list of dependencies. So now I have this variable controller app, which is my application. Kind of like think about it in ASP.NET as your ASP.NET application. That sounded very convincing. So on this controller, now on this application, I have a function which is controller, which takes a name of a controller and the function, what that controller actually does, which in this case doesn't do anything. So what happens if we execute this one? Well, absolutely nothing. If you see it in the browser, nothing comes up. But now I have a controller associated with the view. So what does this allow me to do? Now it allows me to do binding between the controller and the view. I can pass data from the view to the controller and from the controller to the view. How do we do that? If we go to scopes, you can see that I have the same thing here. I have an ng controller, and then I have a message. Now this message in the first demo that I showed you was actually being initialized somewhere, right? Either in the input box via ng model or via some JSON that I had in the page. Where does it come from here? This one is coming from the controller. How do we define it in the controller? Let's go to the controller, which is the scopes controller. Scopes. And you can see here that I have this object called scope, $scope, and to it I'm assigning a message, hello from home controller. Now let me just show you this working, and then I'll come back and explain how it works. So let's run this. You can see that I have hello from home controller. Okay, how does this work? So what is this dollar and what is this message here? So the scope, basically think of it as the bridge between your view and the controller. You can tag properties on it, you can tag functions on it, anything you want. And AngularJS has built-in dependency injection, right? So when I need some dependency, in this case, the scope object, I just pass it as a parameter to the function. Why has it got the prefix $? Well, because JavaScript is a horrible language. Well, no, it's actually beautiful, just if you keep away from it. I actually like JavaScript. I moan about it a lot, but I like JavaScript. The reason for this is that so it doesn't clash with anything that you define. So if this was just called scope, and you define your own object called scope, AngularJS doesn't know what to inject. And since scope is an AngularJS built-in dependency, it prefixes it. So anything with a $ prefix is saying this is Angular's, don't touch. Okay? So now I can get data from the model, from the controller, in this case from the model to the view. Right. So that's kind of AngularJS. Okay, so and I can do other things. I can do, for example, event click. So here, instead of getting model, I can just say ng click, and that will do a click me. And if we run this one, you can see that I say click me please, and it says you clicked me, right? And if we go to this event controller, you can see that I have, instead of a property, I have a function. So basically that's it. So now it's giving you a clear separation of concerns of where to put things. You have on one side your controller, on one side you have your view, which is associated to the controller, and then you have the scope. And the scope is what you use to pass things back and forth. Is that clear? Excellent. Any questions? No. Damn, I explained myself well, don't I? Is anyone still awake? Who said no? Okay, you and I are going to meet later. Okay, so now I have two-way binding, of course, as well, right? I can now take this guy, and I showed you how to get data from the controller to the view, but I can get data from the view to the controller as well, right? I can say, for example, Joe Smith at smith.com, hit save, and it says you entered Joe, right? Taking a look at that code, you can see that I have two-way binding. I am injecting my scope, and then I say on the save button, pass in the person. Where is the person? That's the guy that's associated the model over here. So I have person.name, person.email. So it's that simple. I have a person with some properties on it. I just pass it into the function and access those properties. You know, all of this you can do with jQuery or JavaScript, but this just makes it much faster and cleaner. And I think that everybody here, apart from Rob, agrees. But again, then again, Rob writes closure in Vim. Wait for it, and he uses cursor keys in Vim. I know, that's a false rumor that's I'm spreading for the past 3 years. Never gets old. Anyway. So, now that's all sucks. I mean, it really is horrible what you've just seen there, right? I mean, it's... Now let me show you my design skills. This is where the beauty kicks in. Wait for it. Ever since Bootstrap came out, we've all become brilliant designers. So let me go to the back end and start my PS. And let me now open up this. Right. Okay. Woo. Is that slick or what? Eh? Now you can clap. No, wait. Don't clap. So now watch this. This is a filter box, and I can do something like, for example, Joe. Right? That's nice, isn't it? No. Is there anything I can do to impress you guys? No, that is actually nice. You see, I can do it with that. I can do develop. I can do even dates. No, I can't. But if I put 1, you'll see that something comes up. 2. Right, I broke it. Anyway, so what I have here is basically a list of a grid. Okay, and I have a filter function. So you know how I did this? I'll show you how I did this. This is actually very easy. Let me minimize this so you can see it all. If you go to the list, this is the code for the list. So I have basically a table, and I have the header, and I'm repeating with the ng repeat through the list of data that's coming back to me. Okay? Now here you can see that I have a filter search by, right? That's how I do that filtering. I just added this, right? And that's a filter that AngularJS has built in. And what it does is just filter the context. So that's all I needed to do to provide that filtering. You can see that there's other filters as well. For example, date, medium. What that does is display the date in the format that you saw, right? You can even have your own filters. For example, here I've created a filter called ranking. So this ranking, this level, is actually a number. But if you look at the web page, I'm displaying it as a text. And that's done by a filter. And the way you create that is easily you just come here and you create a filter that tag it onto the application called filter, give the filter a name, ranking, and then based on the input, do whatever you want. Okay? So it's extensible in terms of filtering already. We'll see. Okay? Now, let me show you the index file here, because now this is where it gets interesting with some of the client-side routing. So you see here that this is a little bit big, because basically what I'm doing is including all of the different files in my project. But notice that in the index, which is what launches when you see this page, there is actually no code. Instead, there's this thing called ngview, which is what this client-side routing, or routing, depending on where you're from, comes in. Okay? And what this routing is basically saying is this is where we hit into the famous single-page applications. Right? That is, in fact, a single-page application. But I've shown it after everything else because there's this misconception that AngularJS is only valid for single-page applications, which is absolute nonsense. It's got nothing to do with that. But it does have built-in features for it. So this ngview basically is a placeholder, and what it's going to now do is show partial views, embedded views, based on the routing. What routing? That's the routing you define here. So in my application, now I can have a routing table. And I say, when someone goes to about, show them template about with the about controller. When someone goes to list, show them list with the list controller, and so on and so forth. And I can have hard-coded HTML here, or actually point to a specific file. Okay? So let's take a look. We've already seen the list. Let's take a look at about. Now you see here, this is one of the extensibility points of AngularJS. What do I have there? I have an about message. Now, about message isn't a valid HTML tag, is it? No. What about this one? I have over here in details, sorry, not in details, in add, I have person record. Is that a valid HTML tag? No. This is where Angular's extensibility comes in. And in fact, everything, every tag that you see in Angular, the ng controller, all of these are directives. And what this is a directive. So Angular allows you to extend your application with directives. And what these directives do in turn is add what? Semantics to your application. Because seeing person record means more than seeing this. Yes? You don't know what this is. You have to read through it. Apart from the reusability that it gives you, it provides you with semantics. And the way you create a directive is you just create a person record, point to a directive, and the rest we won't get into, but basically allows you to either point to a URL or point to a template or point to HTML and create little components that you can reuse across your application, providing semantics. And every directive can be either used as an element, which is like this, or as an attribute, or as a class, or as a comment, right? So the ng repeats that you see, the ng app, the ng controller, these are all actual directives. So Angular is pretty much bootstrapped on itself. It's creating these directives and then allowing you to use them. Okay? Now, if we look at this list controller, we see that I'm getting, for example, the data from, let me show you the correct version, which is this one, I'm getting the data from a data service, right? The data service is a service that I've created, which I'm just passing in over here, which we'll see in a moment. And then Angular already has built-in support for promises. Are you familiar with promises in JavaScript? Yeah, which is an easier way to handle callbacks, supposedly. And what I'm doing here is I'm saying if everything is okay, then set the scope to the data that you're returning, and if not, display an error. And that's the best error handling you could possibly have in any application. So let's take a look at this data service. So here I have a data service, and this is another built-in feature of Angular, the resource. And this easily allows you to talk to a backend server. So instead of using jQuery, or instead of using even a HTTP client that Angular has built in, which is $HTTP, it already has a concept of resource. So you can just point to a URL, and then on that URL, you can perform a series of operations. You can do gets, puts, posts, etc. So this ties in very easily with a nice backend that you could create that basically exposes those same resources with those same operations. Okay? And I'm just like a get all. Basically, I'm taking this resource and I'm doing a query on it. And then once it's resolved, I send it back to the caller. Okay? And that gives me what you see here. And then I can select this and update this, save it, and everything is fine. And there are bugs, but anyway, it works. So, any questions? Yeah. Yeah. There's some conventions, right? But you can. I've actually got an example here. You see here, I have a method called create, right? And what I'm doing is I'm calling people create, which is on the resource, right? You can actually create a mapping here, and you can say create, map it to the method post, right? Because in a true RESTful oriented system, you only have a limited set of verbs, right? You have the resource, and then you have get, put, post, delete options. And I'm missing one. Head. So you can create the mapping there. Again, you don't need to. You can just call post or whatever, but it provides you with semantics on your code on the client side. Okay? So the question is, you want to add a query to the resource that you're... You want to add a filter to the resource that you're querying. Yeah, you can also pass in parameters to that, and then you can call those, provide those parameters on the call. Okay, so that is basically summed up in 20 minutes AngularJS. Now I've shown you a couple of things with this, and then we're going to move on to the backend. It provides you with the routing, it provides you with the resources, it provides you with HTTP, it provides you with two-way data binding, it provides you with extensibility via directives, it provides you with built-in filters, you can extend filters. So it's a full framework that brings pretty much everything that you would need in your kind of web development, right? It limits you. Well, no, we've seen that with directives and that it actually doesn't limit you. Now, it's slow. Twitter went from client-side generation to server-side. Okay, one, just because Twitter did it doesn't mean that Twitter did everything absolutely brilliantly. I'm not saying they didn't, but, and two, Not everybody here is creating Twitter, right? Not everybody is creating Twitter. Or are you? Am I going to go home tomorrow and see a new Twitter client from Poland or some server? Others do use it, right? Huffington Post, Google, General Motors, OpenTable, Shift.com, all of these companies, and if you go to Built with AngularJS, you can see a whole list of companies that are actually using this. And for the vast majority of applications that we are building, this is pretty much what you need. It's not only for single-page applications. The only thing that makes it single-page is that ng view that I added, which then gives you the client-side routing, which then allows you to provide partial templates. But you can easily use this with server-side application, with non-SPA applications. So there is no concept of this is only useful if I'm doing SPAs. It's got an easy learning curve? No. This is actually very, very accurate. When you first get to work with Angular, you're like, this is blatantly easy. I mean, I've shown you this and you're like, this is brilliant. This is, right? It's brilliant, right? Right? Yes. Oh. Sure. Was that you, Tibby? Oh, okay. Okay. This is the pretty accurate learning curve. You hit places where you're like, I shouldn't have gone with AngularJS. So it's an up and down roller coaster. Hopefully you will reach nirvana at some point. I don't know yet. No, I'm hoping I'm around the down, just climbing up there. Okay, so that's the front end. Now the back end. Now I'm going to show you something that you've never seen before. Never, ever seen before. Who's heard of Wasabi? Not the spice. Right, okay. So, I work at a company called JetBrains. How many of you have heard of JetBrains? Right, you might remember us from such tools as ReSharper or IntelliJ. So we've also been doing this thing called a language. A language is this thing. We've been creating a language called Kotlin. How many of you have heard of Kotlin? Okay. So Kotlin is like a cut-down version of C#. Or I shouldn't say this in public because I really shouldn't, but especially when I'm being recorded. But I like to say that Kotlin is like Scala for dummies. But it isn't. It's actually quite nice. And I'm not being at all biased. So we've been creating this language called Kotlin, which is basically runs right now on the JVM. Right now runs on the JVM and also compiles down to JavaScript. Okay, and it's a very concise language. It's very expressive. It has a bunch of conventions that allow you to do nice DSL stuff. It's much simpler than Java, which isn't hard to accomplish. And it drastically cuts down your code in Java as well. And I've created a framework, which is what you've actually been seeing here when I did the PS. That's actually the framework Wasabi, which is running in the back end, which allows you to create web applications. Now, if you've ever worked with a framework called Sinatra, how many of you have heard of Sinatra? Right. How many of you went to the Nancy session? Okay. So Nancy is Sinatra's daughter, which is kind of it's based off of the concept of Nancy Sinatra. You get it? You knew that, right? That's why. Okay. Right. So this is based off of the same concept. Now, they're all originating from Sinatra-based frameworks. Why I did this is because I started to work about 2 years ago with Express.js. And I fell in love with Express.js because of the simplicity of Express.js. Unfortunately, it comes with, the mother-in-law, would you say, which is the JavaScript. So I don't like JavaScript. I use it, but I don't like JavaScript. My mother-in-law is actually pretty nice. So I decided that Kotlin was at a stage which is very similar in terms of conciseness to JavaScript, and I liked Express, and that's what Wasabi is. It's born out of that idea, okay? And I'm going to show it to you in the next 6 minutes. So here is your server. basically you have an application server which you start. This is, I'll tell you what this is in a moment. It just negotiates content. And then you have a bunch of different methods on your server. So you have get, post, put, delete, etc. And you pass in a URL, a pattern, and then you pass in a function. Okay, so in Kotlin there's a concept of top level functions, so you don't need to have a static class with static methods to be able to call a function. You can just call it directly, very similar to JavaScript. If we go to get persons, you can see that I have a root handler, which I'll get into in a moment, and I have the actual body of the function, right? Now, a couple of things to note here. Response send, this code here is actually what is the only thing that's required to send back the data that you just saw. Okay, so send, this line that we have, this negotiate content that we have here, that automatically parses the HTTP header, seeing what type of media type has been requested, whether it's application JSON, application XML, etc. And then it finds the correct serializer based on the weights and then serializes the object that you're sending back. Okay, so all that code is basically just response send people. People is an array, right? But what is response? Where is response coming from? Well, to explain that, first let's see what root handler is. Root handler is just basically syntactic sugar, right? It's for me to not have to write that declaration. But this declaration is one of the unique things of Kotlin, which makes it interesting. I'm having a function which I'm passing in another function. But this function is just not a normal function. It's an extension function on the class root handler. Did you get that? No. Do you know what an extension function is? An extension method, right? So you can take any class and you can extend it. Well, you can do that in Kotlin as well. You can take any Kotlin class, you can take any Java class, you can just write fun string dot compiler and add the method compiler to a string class in Java. So what I'm saying here is that the parameter that this takes is an extension function on the class root handler. Why? Well, if you take a look at this, I have response. Where is response coming from? It's a property on the root handler class. Okay? So I don't have to pass in the declaration of the functions every time I use it. Okay? If I go to the root handler, if we go to the root handler class, if I can type, you can see that the root handler has over here a request, a response, and a next, right? So this gives me access to the request object, it gives me access to the response object. And then inside request response, you have basically anything you want. You have all of your headers, you have all of your cookies, you have all of your body parameters, you have everything you want. And in the response, you can send back files, you can send back objects, text, whatever you want. Okay? And Wasabi is, the core of Wasabi is very simple. It's just an HTTP handler. Most of the functionality that you see is then built on what I call interceptors, which unfortunately there's been this promotion of the term middleware coming from the JavaScript scene to call these things middlewares, right? If you're doing Node Connect or Express.js in JavaScript, you've seen middleware. Now Owin and Katana, if you've heard of those things in .NET, they're calling them middleware. I like to call things by what they do, which is intercept. So you can see here that, for example, I have a basic authentication interceptor, which basically is one method that you override. You have access to your request, you have access to your response, and then do all your processing there. All of the content negotiation, all of the serialization, favicon, all of those things are just done with interceptors, right? So it's very extensible in allowing you to build on with all of these things. Okay, so that is that's what I'm using for the demos that you've seen here. It's the backend. It's called Wasabi, and it's still in development, but it's my little moment in my life to show something. You can clap now. No, wait, hold your claps. Okay, so summary. To summarize, embrace client-side frameworks. Don't stay away from them. I honestly feel that they're at a point now that they can allow you to create very clean applications on the client side and help you with a lot of the code that you constantly have to repeat when doing web development. I also say that your application is your API, so make no distinction between your views, your user interface, and the actual API that you're calling. Embrace HTTP as a protocol. Use it beyond what it is. Study it. It's fascinating read. I'm actually, you know, obsessed with HTTP. I'm not saying you need to be obsessed with it, but it is a good bedtime read. And whether it's on client-side frameworks, server-side frameworks, you always have to be careful in trying to apply separation of concerns, because that's what allows you to keep your code maintainable. And test your code pragmatically. I've moved far away from this concept of unit testing everything, right? I now try and make sure that my integration tests are as fast as possible, and if I can do integration tests, I'll do integration tests, right? For example, in Wasabi, I have 0 unit tests. Every single test fires up a Wasabi server and tests everything. And I've got now 34 tests, and it's around 0.8 seconds, okay? Integration tests, focus testability on features, on functionality, as opposed to thousands of little unit tests. More information, AngularJS, those are the links. The most important link for you here is this one. And do you have any questions? No? Bloody hell, I'm brilliant and just on time. Okay, well, thank you very much.